everyone. I'm Stephanie Arell, and today I have with me Ashleigh Gibb, now a friend who I met during a lecture I gave through Sarum College in England on trauma and theology. Ashleigh stood out to me because of her involvement both in the realm of addressing theology and spirituality, but also her commitment to looking at trauma symptomatology and how physical exercise, specifically CrossFit, can kind of speak to that, to our experiences physiologically and neurologically around trauma. So if Ashleigh, could you just say a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself to the audience, and then you and I will have a conversation about that.
Yeah, hi, my name is Ashleigh, and I am a trauma-informed fitness coach. I have been training women for the past 12 years, but then have also been working with survivors of human trafficking for the past 7 years. And since even just working in like a Globo gym, I found that many of the clients that I worked with um, came to me presenting with some trauma, and just watching the transformation of bringing physical fitness to them and nutrition, and to see how that transformed their journey and the empowerment that it gave them in their recovery journey. So I have since used CrossFit with survivors of human trafficking, and have also found that in my own life, it has been a prominent way that I've connected with my body, therefore has been a way that I've connected with my own spirituality. And I'm very passionate about this, and I love speaking about it. So I'm excited to share a little bit more.
Great. So what I think we're going to do is talk to you all about the separate categories at the risk of separating them, but also as a way for us together to start to explore the connection of spirituality, trauma, and physical exercise, specifically CrossFit, how they intertwine in a way that's maybe more in depth. I also want to say meaningful than the way that it gets talked about right now. And I say that specifically because I work in this area of doing rehab with people, but really with specific attention to traumatic episodes and mental health fitness, so to speak. And behind that for me is always thinking about theology, and in specific, the way that I define that is what are people bringing to the fore in their experience with me around big human questions and their interpretation or meaning, the meaning making processes that they have in life, especially related to, in this particular instance with my work, traumatic injuries. What does it mean to have lost the use of a limb, for instance? What is the meaning behind that? Where is that challenging people's beliefs about what goodness is in the world, what health is, and how can that be more deeply negotiated, but then also unpacked in relationship to theology and spirituality. So maybe there's an entrance point, something that I just said for you, Ashleigh, related to spirituality and theology and questions that you're asking as you start on your journey of connecting in a really robust way, because we can say to people, oh, we work in spirituality and fitness, and everybody's like, yeah, great. Yeah, that makes sense. But then when we sit down, it becomes a little more difficult for people to connect. So that's the goal of today. I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, thank you. So for me, and this is kind of no disrespect to all the incredible organizations that are connecting fitness and spirituality, but the way that I had previously kind of seen organizations who were set up in that way, the way they kind of marketed it were, a we're a fitness brand, and we bring spirituality, we bring the gospel to people that engage with our fitness program. And so the way that I'm now viewing this is totally different to that. And so it's definitely good to kind of explain which lens I'm coming from, because it is very, very different to kind of previous organizations that have been doing that. So being a trauma survivor myself, I wrestled a long time with finding the meaning of that in my body. So the trauma that I had experienced was in and against my body, and being part of the church growing up from a young girl, the messaging that I had received was that was very shame based. Was that a woman's body is the
Mm.
we have it in us to cause people to sin. If anything happens to us, then surely it must have been our fault. Um, our body, all our desires need to be shut down. And so they're just growing up. There was a lot of shame around my body. And so when I experienced trauma, I just became very, very ashamed of that body and did everything I could in my power to block out all of the messages that it was trying to tell me. So I dabbled quite hard in drugs,
Mm.
dabbled really hard in drinking, and did anything I could to just shut down what my body was trying to tell me. And in doing so with that, I felt very, very disconnected from my spirituality. So my faith journey, it felt like I was a part of a faith community, but there was a profound disconnect there, and I couldn't understand what it was. I was showing up, I was going through the motions of it, but there was a piece of me that not only felt disconnected from my community, but also felt disconnected from God. And so it was only when I stepped into the arena of physical fitness, completely outside of any faith community, that I started working out. I got really heavily into fitness. Um, and initially, it became a way of me to kind of bury my trauma. It was almost like a punishment.
Mm.
So I battled with an eating disorder as well. And fitness was just another way that I could punish my body. But after a kind of a long exploration and a recovery journey, fitness became the way that I reconnected with myself
Mm.
and my body. And then it became a way that I connected with God. Um, and I began to view my body and my spirituality in a totally different lens, but it still didn't match up with the messaging that I was receiving, because to be passionate and to be kind of celebratory about my body was not something that was done in the church. And so there was still that shame around that. So my life with the church and then my life in a fitness community, they felt very separate. It was like they couldn't join together.
And has that continued to be the case? Are those separate realms for you?
No, no, I wouldn't say so anymore. I've been on a big deconstruction journey over the past few years. I have become really passionate about kind of sharing my story with how I kind of reconnected with that spirituality. And now, when I actually feel very, very overwhelmed, and when I start to experience those symptoms of trauma again, and when I feel quite disconnected from God, for me to get back into my body, whether that's under a heavy barbell, whether it's going
Mm.
for a run, whether it's doing a CrossFit workout, for me, I come into myself and then I kind of experience that reconnection with God again. And
Mm.
I feel able to show up in my faith communities to share about that and to share this message of actually, I'm not part of the faith communities that I once was. So I'm wondering how that would actually feel if I was to revisit those faith communities and be able to speak as confidently as I can, as I do in my new faith communities. So I'm definitely a part of spaces where this is welcomed and people are really curious about my experiences. And they want to have this conversation, they want to ask questions, but I don't know if it would be welcomed necessarily in the communities that I was part of in the
Mm.
past.
I'm sure that there are other people that can share that kind of experience of having a faith community and moving away from them to maybe find another home just based on the way that rhetoric is shaped around our bodies, uh,
Yeah.
as women. There was one thing that you said that struck me about shutting down your body. And what I'm wondering is, in this effort to get deeper with our thinking, is when you say shutting down the body, how does the opposite of that, I don't know how you would express it, awakening the body, reconnecting with the body, I don't know what words you would use, but can you speak directly to what that looks like or feels like or sounds like, or something descriptive in relationship to spirituality? So where does spirituality fall in this, if you want to use the word awakening the body?
Mm, it's a good question. Yeah, I guess in order to answer that, I'd have to kind of get into
Wow.
my mindset of actually how it felt to shut it down.
Right.
And when I was trying to detach from it, and then that kind of tipping point when I started to come back into myself. And I guess, looking back to when I was abusing my body with drugs and alcohol, I wanted to feel nothing.
Mm.
Wanted to feel nothing. So there was no connection. There was no connection with community. I felt very shut off from loved ones, and therefore, because I kind of find God within community. Once I'd shut them off, I felt very disconnected from God.
Yeah.
And so when I started to train and to lift weights, it felt, to begin with, it was a very new sensation, and I was terrified when I when my body started to respond. And it is even just in the sense of, oh, that feels painful, or that feels good. And I'd never experienced that before, because previously I hadn't really allowed it to feel anything.
Mm.
I really wasn't aware of the sensations or the messages. So it was almost like a still small voice in me that was saying, hey, like, you're pushing me too hard. Or actually, like, this is starting to feel really good. And so I then began to get really curious. And I'll be really blunt and really vulnerable and say that when I did start to train, I remember actually being able to, like, look at my body naked in the mirror, which I was always so frightened of doing in the past. And I remember the first time I looked at it and I didn't feel hatred, or I didn't
Wow.
feel disgust at it. But it felt like I was looking at it through the eyes of someone who deeply loved what I saw.
Mm. Mm.
I was like, just a curiosity about it, like, what is this? This is such a new, and it was like a child just
Oh,
beginning
yeah.
to explore again, and I felt that childlikeness. um and in, like, it was almost like a kind of communion with the spirit in me of, like, yeah, this is fun, like, I created this body, let's get curious about it, let's look at it, let's listen to it, let's see what it can do. So I just felt like that 3-year-old who was discovering, like, a whole new world for herself. And I felt like I was doing that with the creator of my body, which felt really intimate and really powerful, and something I just hadn't experienced before.
That's beautiful. I have
Thank
like
you.
goosebumps. Seriously, like to think about connection. That's what I was getting at. Like, what is something practical? And to think about that being that we're capable of looking at ourselves with wonder and curiosity and love
Yeah.
at our bodies, our naked bodies are very, and I'm trying to think of the word. I want to use the word innocent, but that word has so much weight to it. I don't know what's a good word to use. Our childlike bodies, our bodies that are connected to our youngest parts. I'm not sure what.
There is, I guess it's just like a rawness, isn't it? And
Yeah,
I would agree, like, it is kind of childlikeness, because if you think about babies, when they're, like, connecting with their bodies, there's a freedom there.
yeah.
And I think, like, for us just to kind of look at ourselves now, like, even as adults, and look in the
Mhm.
mirror at our naked bodies, there is this, like, childlikeness about it. And because it's so vulnerable, so vulnerable.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
really,
vulnerable.
mm,
Nice. So, how does that experience around reconnection to self, that's through that reconnection is facilitated through actually looking at ourselves, really looking at our bodies, our actual bodies, not just self-reflection in terms of our psychological experience, but looking at, appreciating, acknowledging, loving our external, our bodies, our skin, our flesh. How does that translate for you into thinking about what it means to recover from trauma on a psychological level? And where does trauma, the experience of trauma, fit into that? I know you've mentioned it already, but let's just shift the gear a little bit and look a little bit more at your negotiation, maybe personally, maybe professionally, in relationship to trauma.
Yeah, it's been a long journey. And like I'm very hesitant to say that I've arrived
Mhm.
in terms of my own story and full recovery, because there's definitely still sometimes it's a fight to
Mm.
claim that recovery. And it's a fight to choose self and to choose that self-compassion. Um, and that's kind of, that in itself aids in recovery, the fact that I get to choose each day to wake up, to look at myself and to say that it is good and it is beautiful. And so, and it hasn't been a linear journey. And as I say, like when I started to use fitness, it became more of an addictive
Mm.
thing that I was using to punish my body. Um, and then when I stripped that back, and it wasn't, it was in conjunction with talk therapies. There were other components to it. But I just remember the first time that so I had been into running and I had done yoga, and I had been in just a standard gym and I'd lifted weights. But it was when I walked through the doors of a CrossFit gym, and I think, being around so many different types of people, so many different types of bodies, so many different women with different types of bodies, and they were there in community doing things that blew my mind initially. It blew my mind. I remember thinking like I want to do what they do, because they just seem to like it just there's something about it that I haven't been able to put my finger on in that moment when I was new to it all. So I started training CrossFit about 11, 12 years ago.
Okay.
And I think that's really when my kind of true recovery really began. And I started to do things that my body had never done before. I started to lift weights that it had never lifted before. I don't know if it was a pride or just, again, another different way of looking at my body when I was choosing to make it sweat. I had ownership about how much weight I lifted. It was empowering to do things I'd never done before, where previously my trauma had dictated something else to me. Previously, my trauma had said to me, like, you do not have agency over your body. It had been taken by somebody, um, not through my choice. And it felt like all agency had been gone from
Mm.
me in that time. And actually, in this moment, everything that I was doing to it was a choice. If I wanted to hurt, in what I felt was a good way, I could choose to do that. If I wanted to go into the pain cave with a workout, I was choosing to do that. And I was just shocked at how much my body could endure. And it made me feel really, really powerful. And I think it was in claiming that power and realizing the agency I had over it, the negative kind of messaging that I was sitting in just started to drop away. And I began that journey of recovery. And I think it probably is partly to do with being in community as well, and being around other people that are doing incredible things with their bodies, and not caring about what it looks like. People were caring about more what your body could do instead of what it could look like. It felt safe.
Mm.
It felt like a place where if I was struggling with something that like a message that my trauma was trying to tell me, I could go into this safe space and be with these safe people, let off steam, do some crazy things in my body. And that was deeply healing for me. Really, really healing. And it is still a phenomenon that I can't really, like, I'm struggling to pinpoint. But sometimes I feel like the creator of my body is looking at me while I'm under a heavy barbell and is so proud of me. And that just makes me proud too. Mm.
Thank you. And I, having just in relationship to your trajectory in CrossFit, having just started myself, it's been a couple of years. I think that there's something about CrossFit that does speak to the experience of trauma in a real particular way that I have never in my life in working with traumatic injuries ever encountered. And I think that I think that meeting you has been very exciting for me because it's like, oh, I have somebody with whom to dialogue to kind of try to understand what are these things. So as you were talking, three things sort of jumped out at me, and I was wondering if we could look at each, the piece by piece in terms of thinking about the trajectory of trauma and what trauma does. So if we look theoretically at the efforts of any perpetrator, and this is the realm we're in, I'm guessing for you, is a human betrayal and perpetration by another person, not a natural disaster, not a mass trauma. So all of those things, they all share characteristics and symptoms in the aftermath, but they are distinct experiences. So once again, we're dealing with person to person violence and betrayal trauma on the body.
Mhm.
So this would entail, in terms of its definition of being trauma, an experience of feeling powerlessness and feeling helplessness.
Yeah.
So in this way, you've kind of already addressed that there is an aspect of CrossFit that is offering back the ability to take agency. So,
Yeah.
and when I'm talking to people and doing any kind of work about trauma, I always reinforce this idea of agency is critical.
Mhm.
Now, I'll add one more piece to that. So that's one piece, and the third one I'll leave for another question. But the second piece of that relates to fear. And
Mm.
there's a lot of ways to negotiate fear. So I want to put it in terms of agency, and then I want to ask you another question afterwards related to fear. So first, when people feel fear, especially as a result of this sensation of being powerless or helpless, uh, the inclination physiologically is to fight, flight, or freeze. And freeze is a very common one for women, which entails like going into a fetal position, right? So that's the physiology. Well, you can't do that in CrossFit or it
Mm.
doesn't work. So, and I don't mean to make light of it, but there's something really physiologically capable of doing in CrossFit that's a real flat out exception to what the trauma response would have the body do. Can you speak to that?
Oh gosh, yeah, sorry, it just made me emotional. I think you've actually just hit the nail on the head. Yeah, that is huge because my typical response has been to freeze, and I in the past have frozen at making decisions. I have lost my voice, and I really wrestled with this. And actually coming into CrossFit, I have been faced with workouts that have been at the start seemingly so terrifying. Um, and when I'm in it, I'm like, oh shit, like I'm feeling this. I'm feeling this in my body. Like I can feel all those signs of the thought of like I'm about to get really overwhelmed. And I've got an option here. Like I'm in the workout, especially when I'm in competition. And actually, I really sit on two fences about competitive CrossFit, and kind of doing it as like a lifestyle for health. But there have been times when I have been on the competition stage in front of everybody and I'm feeling like that trigger. I'm feeling like I'm about to lose control. I'm scared. This hurts. And yet I have chosen to go through it, and to stay like in the fight, to stay in the pain of the workout. And once I've come over the other side of that, when I've regulated myself, I'm like, okay, you've got to control your heart rate here. You've got to just keep moving. You've got to put one foot in front of the other. And I've got through that. The feeling is like no other.
Mm.
And I think that is probably one of the most empowering things in CrossFit, that when I've come out the other side, I'm like, my body just did that. Like I didn't freak out. I didn't freeze. I didn't run from it. I endured it. And you know how that has, over the past 12 years, how that has transferred into my life when I have come to paralyzing situations. And my body's like, no, we know how to do this. We can be in this
Yeah.
difficult situation and we know how to take the next step without freezing. And yeah, that's it. Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. It's
Yeah.
amazing. I mean, but it's just, I mean, I think I am amazed by the capacity of this particular modality to address and help people move through trauma stored in their bodies. I agree with everything that you just said. I'm fascinated by CrossFit's capability of really, as a modality, adjusting to physical bodies, but challenging those bodies to move and move through challenging exercises that counter the trauma response physiologically. And I talked to you about this before, but even the complex of the hip flexor, which is the muscle that contracts for fight, flight, or freeze, there are so many instances in CrossFit where that muscle has to be extended under duress. And when that happens, there's a kind of physiological release or confidence in the body to hold what are called power positions, which is your hands up over your head like this and your legs extended. So that being, for people that know, that the thruster being one of those movements, and in some way a wall ball exercise is that all of the pull-ups have that same positional quality at some point. So, and we could break all this down, and maybe we will to a more extent at a later date. But what I would like you to speak to is that a lot of people, and women mostly, and maybe everyone, you probably know better than I, working in a gym environment, but what do we say when people are afraid to actually start or do the movements of CrossFit, especially when there's a personal knowledge of the fact that it can really help so much and has so much carryover into life circumstances and decision making?
Yeah, I mean, I'm faced as a coach, I'm faced daily with people because coming into the gym, like I always say to new people, it is one of the most vulnerable spaces that you will step into. And not only that, like every person that comes in is bringing with them a story.
Mm,
And so I think back to the survivors that I work with who I've introduced to CrossFit, and even just the regular everyday gym goer that comes in. And there is a fear, and there's fear on so many different levels, and it's different for everybody. A fear of like shame, or what if I can't do this? What if my body breaks? A distrust of their own body, and actually, you know, I um I wrote my thesis for my master's on this, and I kind of commented about how, like, at the start, I was so passionate about this and so gung ho and so believed in it. I needed everyone to believe it too. But actually, I had to make sure that I went at the pace of the person that I was working with, and held their fear and respected that fear, and eased them in at a pace that felt comfortable for them. Because the beauty of CrossFit is that I think that, people will look at CrossFit, they'll Google it, they'll YouTube it, and they'll see high level competitive athletes. And that can be really intimidating, can be really scary. But actually, I've had like 75, 80-year-olds in my gym who've
mm,
come in, women that have never touched a barbell. And they are weightlifting and they're doing pull-ups, and they were terrified when they stepped in. But actually, having a trusted coach
mm,
who understands that vulnerability and who honors and respects that fear and doesn't come with their own agenda, I think that is gold dust in a CrossFit gym, and it's so needed. And so then people can test it a little bit, put their toes in the water, see if something feels good. And initially the body might reject, like, it doesn't feel good, like this hurts, that hurts. And I always say to other coaches, if someone tells you this hurts, believe them. Don't doubt them or say no, it doesn't hurt. It's in your head. Believe what they say and work with them. Okay, so if this hurts, what does work for you? What does feel good for you? And also getting them to understand that there's a difference between pain and discomfort. You're
mm.
going to feel discomfort, and that's not something to be afraid of. So lean into it, but take it slow and know that, I'm always going to be there to walk alongside you. I think of one client who I train in the gym who came with quite large mental health problems. And initially she was terrified, and everything kind of presented as pain in her body. And because I believed her and because I honored what she was telling me, she went at her pace. And now looking at her now, she is doing some crazy things that she never imagined, just because she dipped her toes, because she she felt listened to, she felt heard, and she felt safe enough to try new things. Um, so I think it's just so important that we
Mm.
go at the client's pace and listen to what they're trying to say and communicate.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out, and I'm always thinking in terms of trauma recovery, because of what I do for a living. And one of the things that you've just pointed out has to do with the element of, we can't do these things alone. And then the second is that the element of trust with the coach is really, really critical. And so building that trust is not a wasted activity, especially if we're dealing with people who have, and who doesn't, some kind of history related to mental health or any kind of trauma. Another thing that struck me earlier and when you were talking, and now that's come to bear again, is in trauma theory, there's this idea that all of your experiences become ideally part of your new reality.
Mhm.
And if we're looking at Judith Herman, who's my go-to, uh, she says that the experience of trauma is not to be exercised. It's not that we can ever get rid of it
Mm,
or expunge it from our bodies, but rather integrate it. And I
yeah.
think as you start to talk about the physicality and your own experiences, this word integration seems to me wholly operative in CrossFit as a modality. And it's just I'm having visualizations of all the different moves. And when you're saying doing crazy things in the gym, you are actually visually thinking about some crazy things.
Yeah.
So maybe you can talk about integration and allow that kind of conceptualization to move us into thinking about more of CrossFit as a modality.
CrossFit is the way that it integrates so many different kind of modalities of fitness as well, and how you're right, you you have to build a solid foundation. So, for example, um, the thruster or even the pull up or the clean and jerk, a particular weightlifting movement in CrossFit, that is integrating so many different moving pieces to it. And so, for a thruster, you can't just do a thruster. You've got to have a squat, and then you've got to have an overhead press, and then that all comes together to make up a nice fluid movement. And so, having that solid foundation um, is vital. And again, if you remove any part of that, then the whole kind of movement kind of comes melting down like a house of cards. There's definitely something to be said in terms of the integration that happens in CrossFit. And as I said in our kind of previous question, that you know the lessons that I have learned and the way that CrossFit has transferred over into my daily life, I am faced with really scary things I have to do in life, especially in the area of work that I'm in. I am constantly surrounded by people who experience trauma every day. Um, that can sometimes bring up for me my own trauma. I have to make really, really hard decisions um, that affect the lives of other survivors. And there are times when as I kind of expressed before, my go-to response is to freeze. And when I feel paralyzed with indecision, or I feel paralyzed because I'm terrified, or I feel paralyzed because I feel very exposed, or my vulnerability feels exposed, I can rewind back to 5:30 this morning
Mm,
when I was in a 12-minute CrossFit workout doing burpees and thrusters, which are two incredibly difficult movements to put yourself through in a CrossFit class. It challenges your cardio fitness, it challenges your strength. There's a point in the workout you'll get to where you think, I am at my peak. I do not think that I can break through this wall. I want to quit. And actually, at 5:30 this morning, I was able to push through that barrier. And I made that choice myself to continue, and I didn't run away and I didn't freeze.
mm,
And so I can take what I learned from there and I can transfer that into, this big scary decision, or when I feel triggered, or when I feel again quite out of control of my body, or I don't feel in sync with my body, I can go back to that moment and hold on to it. And it is, I can almost I can visualize it now as I did that workout this morning. Um, and actually in reverse of that, having just recently completed a CrossFit competition, one of the workouts was burpee box jump overs and wall balls. Typically quite a good workout for me, but it was hell. And I remember I had had a really, really long day at work, hadn't slept. I'd coached in the morning as well as doing my full-time job. And I put myself through that workout. And the messaging that I told myself before I went into the workout was, you're tired, like you can't do
Mhm.
it, like you've had a rough day. It's just really going to go quite badly. And so I'd already told myself that. And sure enough, midway through that workout, I started to panic. I could feel myself racing through it. But I've done this long enough now that I come to a place of like, I've got a choice. Like I've broken through this
Mm.
barrier before, I'll do it again. And I finished, the workout, not the best I could have done, but I did it. And to me, that was a really, really powerful choice to make. And that carries me through
Yeah.
life so, so much. And I've not experienced anything that has done that to me in the past.
I think that that's for me, the if I was to want to share with people something about CrossFit, it would be that carryover.
Yeah.
So, and I do want to say, I think it's important that there's a safety component, right? That people, I think you spoke to this earlier about having coaches that you trust and understanding what's the difference between pain and discomfort, because there's loads of discomfort, but it doesn't have to be painful. And there are so many modifications so that the workouts can be adjusted to any body. I once saw an Instagram pretty recently of like two versions of burpees in like the athletic way and then the most basic. And it's like anybody could do the most basic, you know? So I find that fascinating. And I think that there's really something to this idea of carryover. In the word that I put to it was the idea of integrating what you learn in a CrossFit class into real life experience, especially for women.
Yeah. And I think, in my perfect ideal world, every coach in a CrossFit gym would be trauma informed. Now, that isn't always the case. And I think you see that when, you know, I've had coaches that have typically been male that have like yelled at me. And for
Mm.
some people, they really like the experience of being yelled at and like, go harder. But for me, like, if I'm ever having somebody judge me, I will always say politely, like, I really appreciate it if you encourage me, if you didn't yell in my face, because that doesn't work for me at all. And actually, like, the battle for me is sometimes I'll switch off from everybody around me, and it's just me and my voice and myself. And can I get myself through this workout? Can I listen to that still voice that I have in me that's guiding me through, that's saying, like, you know how to do this, you know what to do, keep it calm. And that is just me and myself. I don't need anybody around me kind of screaming in my face for me to do that. But it's a very kind of, in that sense, quite individualistic what's
Mm.
going on with me and my body and my voice in my head all of that time.
So, is there anything else you'd want to say about CrossFit, or do you think we've pretty much covered a good
Yeah,
ground for today?
I think so. Yeah.
And if we were to end with offering something about the connection between spirituality, trauma, and CrossFit as a modality, uh, what would you offer just in relationship to this conversation? Because I know this is just the beginning.
Yeah, it is just the beginning. And I think this is such an exciting concept. And I think, for anybody that hasn't tried this before and is curious about it, but typically has seen, you know, has seen spirituality and fitness or CrossFit and trauma as three kind of separate components. Actually, I would just really encourage like to get curious, because
Uh,
I've walked the integration of it, and I've seen it do incredible things, not only in my own life, but also with, survivors of trafficking that I work with. And I think um, it can be so easy just to compartmentalize them, um, and to say like, my 1 hour in the gym, that's
mm,
so separate to the trauma that I hold in my body. And then the church I go to on a Sunday,
mm,
they're all different. And I want to keep them separate. But actually, you're doing yourself a huge disservice, because I think once
mm.
you learn that there's such a perfect dance between the three, it, yeah, something beautiful happens.
Something beautiful happens. That's
Yeah.
lovely. All right. So for our time today, we'll close out on something beautiful happens in relationship to those three things. And I look forward to talking again. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day.
Cool.